Lesson 3, Conflicts Grow. Build on what you know. Today you can find out what is happening in the world from radio, television, newspapers, or the internet. In colonial America, however, it was harder to learn about the news. Colonial leaders decided they needed better ways to share news. Trouble in Boston. Main idea? Events in Boston created more trouble between the colonists and the British government. Remember that Britain had sent soldiers to protect its officials in Boston. The people of Boston did not want British soldiers in their city. Frustrated colonists often fought with the soldiers. On March 5, 1770, a fight began when a crowd of people in Boston argued with a British soldier. The crowd yelled insults and threw snowballs. More soldiers arrived, and suddenly one of them fired a shot. Then several other soldiers fired their guns. 5 colonists were killed. One of them was Crispus Attucks, an African-American sailor who is remembered today as a hero. Afterward, angry colonists called the fight a massacre. A massacre is a killing of many people. Notice there's a picture of Crispus Attucks down there. One of the 5 men killed during the Boston Massacre was Crispus Attucks. He was a sailor who had escaped from slavery. Go to page 241. There's your picture of Paul Revere's Boston Massacre picture. Okay, colonists take action. Paul Revere, a son of liberty and a Boston silversmith, created a picture of the Boston Massacre. It showed British soldiers shooting at colonists who are peaceful, not angry. The Sons of Liberty used the picture to convince colonists that British soldiers were dangerous. The soldiers at the Boston Massacre were put on trial. John Adams, an important Boston lawyer, defended the soldiers at their trial. He wanted to show Britain that colonial courts were fair. Adams tried to prove that the soldiers had been protecting themselves from the crowd. 6 soldiers were found innocent, and 2 were lightly punished. At the time of the Boston Massacre, news traveled slowly. Samuel Adams wanted more colonists to know what was happening around the colonies. In 1772, Adams and other colonial leaders in Boston set up the Committees of Correspondence to share news with the other colonies. Correspondence is written communication. Soon every colony had committees of correspondence. They sent each other letters about what the British were doing and what actions the colonists could take. Turn to page 242, and we get into the Boston Tea Party, which we should have heard about already. The main idea: colonists worked together to oppose British taxes and laws. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act. This law allowed the East India Company of Britain to sell tea in America at a very low price. For years, merchants had avoided paying taxes by smuggling tea into the colonies from other countries. The Tea Act made taxed tea even cheaper than smuggled tea. If colonists bought the inexpensive tea, they would be paying a British tax at the same time. They did not believe that Parliament should tax them without their agreement. They also did not want only one company to control the tea trade. Boston merchants would not sell the East India tea. It sat unloaded on the ships in Boston Harbor. British officials refused to allow the tea to go back to Britain. Colonists decided to get rid of the unwanted tea. On the night of December 16th, 1773, several dozen Sons of Liberty boarded the ships illegally. They threw the tea into the harbor. This event is known as the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party shocked the British. Parliament, led by Lord Frederick North, passed laws called the Coercive Acts to punish colonists in Massachusetts. To coerce means to force. The colonists called these laws the Intolerable Acts. Intolerable, means unbearable. The laws stopped trade between Boston and Britain, ended most town meetings, and gave Britain more control over the colony's government. British soldiers returned to Boston. Bostonians had to quarter the soldiers. To quarter people is to give them food and shelter. Committees of correspondence spread news of the intolerable acts. People throughout the colonies were furious with Britain. They felt the laws were too harsh. So, page 243, they're going to start the First Continental Congress. Colonists agreed to hold a meeting to discuss the intolerable acts. They sent delegates to meet in Philadelphia. A delegate is someone chosen to speak and act for others. On September 5th, 1774, delegates from every colony except Georgia met. The meeting became known as the First Continental Congress. The Congress wrote a letter to the British government and the American colonists. The letter said that the colonists should have the same freedoms as other British citizens. It asked King George III and Parliament to stop taxing colonists without their agreement and to repeal or take back the intolerable acts. The delegates decided to meet again in May if the king refused their demands. In the meantime, the colonists stopped trade with Britain. They began to train for battle in case war with Britain broke out. The king made plans to send more soldiers to Boston. He declared that the colonists had begun a rebellion. So, why did the First Continental Congress meet? And then we have our lesson summary. British soldiers killed several colonists in the Boston Massacre. The committees of correspondence helped different colonies stay in touch. In 1773, colonists dumped tea into Boston Harbor to protest the Tea Act. Britain passed the Intolerable Acts in response to the Boston Tea Party. Why it matters. Disagreement over taxes increased conflict between the colonists and the British government. In other words, they are not getting along. Stop there before we go on to Lesson 4. Lesson 4, War Begins. Build on what you know. When Britain and France could not agree on control of the Ohio River Valley, they went to war. What do you think happened when Britain and the colonists disagreed and could not get along anymore? Moving toward war. The main idea is conflict between the colonists and Britain led to the battles of Lexington and Concord. In other words, we are starting the Revolutionary War. In 1775, many colonists felt that the Intolerable Acts were too harsh. There were more than 3,000 British soldiers in Boston. The British Navy blocked Boston Harbor to keep ships from entering or leaving Boston. Patriots spoke out against the British government. Colonists who opposed British rule called themselves patriots. Mercy Otis Warren was a patriot writer. She wrote plays criticizing British officials in Boston. In Virginia, Patrick Henry, another patriot, said that he was eager for a war with Britain. Many colonists shared his views. Throughout the colonies, militias prepared for war. A militia is a group of ordinary people who train for battle. Most of the men in the militia were farmers. And that's a picture of them down at the bottom. The men in militias did not have much training, but they were willing to fight to defend their homes. Now on page 251, you've got the picture of Paul Revere's ride. And notice that there were 2 other people that went with him, the route of Prescott, the route of Dawes, and the route of Paul Revere. So make sure you are checking that out. They're coming from Boston, going from Boston up to Lexington, and then Concord. Paul Revere's ride. British leaders were worried about the militias. General Thomas Gage, the new British governor of Massachusetts, had orders to stop any possible rebellion. He learned that patriots were storing gunpowder and cannons in Concord, about 20 miles from Boston. Gage decided to send soldiers to destroy the supplies. The soldiers would march at night to take the patriots by surprise. General Gage could not keep his plan secret. Patriots in Boston soon knew what was planned. They used lanterns in the tower of Boston's Old North Church to warn patriots outside the city that British soldiers were coming. 2 patriots also rode out to warn the militia. One rider was Paul Revere, the silversmith. The other was William Dawes. Have you ever heard that saying, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm to every Middlesex village and farm. That's part of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride. Go back to the top of 251. On the night of April 18th, 1775, an army of 700 British soldiers set off for Concord. Revere and Dawes galloped ahead, alerting sleeping Minutemen along the way. Minutemen were militia with special training. They had to be ready for battle at a minute's notice. Racing through the night, Revere told the Minutemen, "The regulars are coming out." Regulars was a word for British soldiers. Other writers, such as Samuel Prescott, helped Revere and Dawes. British soldiers captured Revere in Lexington, but Dawes and Prescott escaped. Prescott rode on to Concord. The soldiers later released Revere. So you kind of wonder, why did Paul Revere become more famous than Dawes or Prescott? Okay, go to page 252. The first battles. Main idea is colonists and British soldiers fought 2 battles in Massachusetts. The British soldiers reached Lexington just before sunrise on April 19th. A small group of Minutemen were waiting there. A British officer told the Minutemen to leave. As the Minutemen turned to go, someone fired a shot. No one knows whether the shot came from a British soldier or a colonist. Both sides began shooting. When they stopped, 8 colonists were dead and 9 were wounded. Only 1 British soldier had been hurt. The British marched on to Concord. As the British searched Concord for hidden weapons, more Minutemen gathered nearby. Fighting soon started. The Minutemen forced the British to turn back toward Boston. Many years later, the poet Ralph Waldo Emerson called this event "the shot heard round the world," which was the very first shot at Lexington. The British soldiers were in dangerous situation on the way back. Patriots from the towns between Concord and Boston, as well as towns farther north and south, were ready. As the British marched back to Boston, colonists shot at them from behind trees and stone walls. More than 250 British soldiers were wounded or killed before the British reached Boston. News of the battles of Lexington and Concord spread quickly. More and more militias arrived in Boston. Soon, thousands of armed colonists surrounded the city. The British in Boston were trapped. Okay, notice the battles of Lexington and Concord at the bottom. 1 o'clock in the morning, Paul Revere and the others warned the Minutemen that British soldiers are marching to Concord. By 5 o'clock in the morning, Minutemen clashed with the British at Lexington. The Minutemen are forced to flee. The drum on the left was used by the Minutemen at Lexington. Then, by 8 o'clock in the morning, colonists and the British soldiers began shooting at each other at the Old North Bridge in Concord. The British turned back after several of their soldiers are killed. And by noon, the British began to march back to Boston. During the long march, thousands of Minutemen shoot at them from behind trees and stone walls. The British soldiers finally reached safety in Charleston at 7 p.m. Okay, go to the top of page 253, Bunker Hill. After the Patriot militia surrounded Boston, they had time to plan. Militia leaders decided to build a fort on Bunker Hill, across the Charles River from Boston. From there, they could fire cannons at the British soldiers in Boston. When the militia reached Bunker Hill, they chose to build their fort on Breed's Hill instead. It was closer to Boston. They worked through the night of June 16th, building a fort with dirt walls 6 feet high. The next morning, the surprised British attacked the fort. More than 2,000 British soldiers began to march up Breed's Hill. William Prescott, a Patriot leader, told the militia. When the British were close enough, the militia in the fort began shooting. Many soldiers fell, and the British were forced back. Minutes later, the British attacked again and were turned back. The third time the British attacked, the Patriots ran out of gunpowder. The British finally captured the fort, but more than half of their soldiers were hurt or killed. The battle was called the Battle of Bunker Hill, although it was fought on Breed's Hill. The British won, but the Patriots had proved well. One British general said that winning another battle like it would have ruined us. They could not afford to lose so many soldiers. Okay, go to page 254, a colonial army. Main idea. The Second Continental Congress prepared for a war against Britain. Remember that the First Continental Congress had sent a list of demands to the British government? When Britain refused to meet their demands, the colonial delegates gathered again in Philadelphia in the spring of 1775. This meeting became known as the Second Continental Congress. The delegates knew that they might soon be at war with Britain. They needed more than an untrained militia to win a war against the British. They needed an army. The militia only fought for a few months at a time. Soldiers in an army fight until a war is over. Congress decided to create a new army called the Continental Army. The members of the Continental Army would be trained soldiers, like the British. Congress looked for a commander for the new Continental Army. A commander is the officer in charge of an army. In June of 1775, they chose George Washington. Washington had fought in the French and Indian War. People knew he was a brave and skilled soldier. Washington rode to Boston to organize the Continental Army. The Olive Branch Petition. Many delegates to the Continental Congress did not want war with Britain. They only wanted to be treated fairly. Congress made one more try at peace with Britain. In July of 1775, the delegates sent King George III the Olive Branch Petition. A petition is a written request from a number of people. The olive branch is a symbol of peace. The petition asked the king to help end the conflict. King George did not even read the olive branch petition. Instead, he just sent more soldiers to the colonies. Notice on page 255, we've got Ticonderoga. That's the cannons that they're moving. For the next 9 months, the British Army stayed in Boston. Washington spent that time turning the colonial militia into a real army. He also sent a trusted officer, Colonel Henry Knox, to Fort Ticonderoga in New York. Americans had captured the fort and its cannons earlier that year. Knox and his soldiers dragged the cannons to Boston. When the cannons arrived, the British decided to leave Boston. On March 17, 1776, they sailed out of Boston Harbor. Forcing the British to leave Boston was a success for the Patriots, but the war was just beginning. What was the Olive Branch Petition? Lesson summary. British soldiers and colonists fought at Lexington and Concord, and again on Breed's Hill. The Second Continental Congress made George Washington commander of the new Continental Army. Congress also sent King George III the Olive Branch Petition in an attempt to make peace, but he ignored it. Why it matters? Battles in Massachusetts were the beginning of the war to free colonists from British rule. In other words, the war has begun. This is a picture on page 256 and 257 of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Remembering most of the fighting actually occurred on Breed's Hill. Underneath Battle of Bunker Hill. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. A Patriot officer is said to have given this famous order as 2,000 British soldiers marched closer and closer up the hill. It was June 17, 1775. The Battle of Bunker Hill in Charleston was the first major clash between large numbers of British soldiers and the Patriot militia. The geography of Charleston forced the British attackers to march uphill. Why did this make a difference? Okay, go to the events of June 17th, 1775. Number 1, which is over on the left-hand page, Patriot militia built a fort on Breed's Hill to fire on British ships and soldiers in Boston. They first planned to build their fort on Bunker Hill, but it was too far from Boston. Cannons for number 2 is out by that ship. Cannons on British ships could not destroy the Patriots' fort. Number 3, the British in Boston fired red-hot cannonballs and set Charleston on fire. 3 times, number 4, over in the middle on the green, 3 times British soldiers marched slowly uphill toward the fort. Hot, tired, weighed down by 125 pounds of gear, the British soldiers were easy targets for Patriot gunfire. And of course, number 5, to save ammunition, the Patriots waited to shoot until the British soldiers were almost on top of them. The British only captured the fort when the Patriots ran out of bullets. The end. This happens to be a picture, though, of the very first shots at Lexington, on Lexington Green.